child and I'm heading down to the surf. Gonna see my Johnny, gonna meet him down at the surf.
She was only 17 when it happened. A girl who had been singing about surfers, sunshine, and teenage crushes just months earlier suddenly found herself crouched behind sandbags, hearing the crack of gunfire rip through the air. Why was little Pattie, Australia's bubbly pop princess, performing in a war zone mere meters from one of the deadliest battles in her nation's military history? Most people remember her as the blonde-haired teen idol with a voice as sweet as summer. But few know that her innocence was shattered in the steaming jungles of Vietnam on the day the Battle of Long Tan broke out. The same voice that once cheered up a generation of teenagers would, from that moment on, carry a quiet, aching trauma, one she didn't speak about for decades. Before PTSD was even a public conversation, she had lived it. Before others would acknowledge the deep emotional wounds of war, she had already buried hers deep inside. Behind every cheerful performance, there lingered an unspoken memory, the smell of blood, the echo of chaos, and the moment a girl stopped being a girl. What really happened to little Pattie in Vietnam? What did she witness that day, and why did it take her years to speak about it? This is not just a story of a young girl singing in a strange place. It's about how war steals more than lives. Sometimes it steals voices, not by silencing them, but by burdening them forever. In the early 1960s, Australia was riding a wave of cultural transformation. The post-war generation had come of age, and with them emerged a new youth culture. Energetic, carefree, and deeply influenced by American surf rock, British pop, and Hollywood glamour. It was in this vibrant context that a petite teenager from Sydney named Patricia Amphlett burst onto the music scene under the stage name Little Pattie. With her iconic blonde bob, knee-length skirts, and an infectious smile, she became an instant sensation. At just 14 years old, she released He's My Blonde-Headed, Stompy-Wumpy, Real Gone Surfer Boy, a song as lighthearted as its title was long. The single raced up the charts, turning her into a national sweetheart almost overnight. Her appeal wasn't just musical. She represented an idealized image of 1960s Australian innocence, cheerful, obedient, and untouched by the complexities of the adult world. She performed on major TV shows, graced magazine covers, and played sold-out concerts across the country. Every parent trusted her. Every teenager adored her. She was Australia's very own beachside Cinderella. But behind the curtain of pop culture, the world was changing. Australia had committed troops to the Vietnam War, aligning with its allies in a controversial move that would deeply divide the nation for years to come. While political leaders spoke of duty and alliances, thousands of young men, barely older than Pattie herself, were sent into the unknown, into jungles where bullets and landmines replaced surfboards and transistor radios. It was during this turbulent chapter that little Pattie received an invitation, or perhaps a summons, that would alter her life forever. She was asked to join a morale-boosting entertainment tour, traveling to Vietnam to perform for Australian troops stationed near the front lines. For many artists, it was a patriotic gesture. For Pattie, barely out of high school, it was something else entirely, a journey into a world her songs had never prepared her for. In August 1966, she landed in Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, accompanied by entertainer Col Joy and the Joy Boys Band. The stage was a makeshift platform in the middle of a dusty military base. Soldiers gathered, eager for a taste of home, laughter, and normalcy. And Pattie delivered, singing, smiling, doing her best to uplift the weary. But what no one expected was what would unfold just beyond the tree line. That very afternoon, the Battle of Long Tan began, one of the bloodiest and most infamous engagements for Australian forces in the entire war. It wasn't distant gunfire. It was close, terrifying, and sudden. Shells whistled overhead. Soldiers were pulled from the audience mid-show. Some never returned. Pattie and the band were rushed off stage, evacuated under threat as the battle escalated just a few hundred meters away. That performance, in a war zone, amid chaos, would become etched in Australian military folklore. But for little Pattie, it was no story to celebrate. It was the moment a veil was torn. The girl who once sang about the beach would return home changed, haunted by things she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. What began as an innocent tour of duty would mark the start of a lifelong reckoning. not only with the trauma she witnessed, but with a nation reluctant to talk about the hidden costs of war. And in the decades that followed, she would struggle between maintaining her public image and confronting the private ghosts that followed her long after the applause faded. Long before the jungles of Vietnam stole her sleep, little Pattie was living every teenage girl's dream. Born Patricia Amphlett in 1949, she grew up in Mascot, a working-class suburb of Sydney, in a family steeped in music. Her cousin was none other than Chrissy Amphlett, the future lead singer of the Divinyls. But it was Pattie who first stepped into the limelight. She was barely a teenager when her life took a sharp turn towards stardom. After being discovered singing in a school band, she landed a contract with EMI. Her debut single in 1964, He's My Blonde-Headed, Stompy-Wumpy, Real Gone Surfer Boy, became a runaway hit. With its catchy beat and playful lyrics, it topped charts and captured the carefree spirit of the time. She was marketed as Australia's answer to the American teen idols, a fusion of innocence and pop culture fantasy. Every detail of her image was carefully crafted. She wore modest outfits, spoke politely in interviews, and projected the kind of clean-cut charisma that made her a staple on TV shows like Bandstand. Behind her was a team of promoters and producers who shielded her from scandal, projecting her as a wholesome symbol of youth, and it worked. The public embraced her with uncritical adoration. But even as her star rose, the world around her was turning darker. Australia's involvement in Vietnam escalated. Thousands of young men were conscripted, and the public mood began to sour. Music, once an escape, became a vehicle for political expression. Some artists refused to support the war. Others, like Cole Joy, agreed to perform for the troops as part of the Goodwill Tours, seen as gestures of support, not necessarily for the war, but for the soldiers. When Pattie was asked to join the tour in 1966, she didn't hesitate. She felt honored. At just 17, she boarded a military transport plane bound for Vietnam, with no real understanding of what she was walking into. It was billed as a brief morale-boosting tour. She thought she would sing, smile, maybe shake some hands. What she got was a crash course in the brutal realities of war. At Nui Dat, she performed in the midday heat. Soldiers gathered, laughing and cheering, clapping for the tiny blonde girl in the modest dress singing about love and summer. Her voice, clear and pure, pierced through the humid air like a beacon of home. For a few minutes, the men forgot where they were. Then everything changed. As she was wrapping up her set, news came in. A patrol had been ambushed. Soldiers were scrambling, helicopters lifted off nearby, and suddenly they were being evacuated. Not through the VIP lounge or red carpet, but through a dirt trail under threat. The Battle of Long Tan had begun. Though she was rushed away from direct combat, the sound of gunfire followed her. The smell of gunpowder lingered. She saw fear, real fear, in the eyes of men who'd just been laughing moments earlier. When she returned to Australia, there were no medals, no press conferences. The government barely acknowledged the battle, and no one asked the 17-year-old girl what she saw or what it did to her. She resumed performing, back on the bandstand, back in the spotlight. But something was different, a flicker of detachment, a certain distance in her smile. Her career moved forward, more singles, more tours, more applause. But inside, the girl who had danced on beaches was now carrying a secret weight. Over the years, her fame gently receded as new pop idols emerged. But she remained a respected figure, working behind the scenes, performing at charitable events, and becoming a quiet champion for veterans. For decades, she didn't speak publicly about what happened in Vietnam. Not because she was ashamed, but because no one had asked, and perhaps she wasn't ready. Until one day, she did speak. And what she revealed shocked many. She had never stopped hearing the echoes of that battle. She had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that, at the time, wasn't even recognized for civilians, let alone entertainers. Her cheerful image had hidden years of silent suffering. What the cameras captured in 1966 was a smiling girl on a makeshift stage. What they missed was everything that came after. For years, the memory of Long Tan clung to little Pattie like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She returned from Vietnam to a country that didn't want to talk about the war, let alone listen to a teenage pop star who had seen the front lines. No one asked what it felt like to be evacuated under fire. No one wondered how she managed to keep singing as the helicopters thundered overhead. The truth was simple. She wasn't supposed to talk. She was supposed to smile. But trauma doesn't care about image. It seeps in quietly and waits. In private, Pattie struggled. Nightmares, anxiety, a feeling of guilt she couldn't name. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't carry a gun, but she had been there. She had seen the fear in the soldiers' faces, heard the gunfire behind the stage, felt the sheer terror of knowing death was not far away. She carried those sights, those sounds, like invisible wounds. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s when Australia finally began acknowledging the psychological toll the war had taken on its veterans that she began to speak. And when she did, her words were clear, measured, and heartbreaking. "I still remember the smell of the jungle, the sweat, the gunpowder," she said in one interview. "I remember being told to keep singing, to keep the boys calm. And I did. I smiled, I sang. But inside, I was falling apart." She revealed that she had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition commonly associated with combat veterans, but almost never with performers. It was, she said, a hidden affliction. No one thought to ask the entertainers how they were coping. No one assumed they could be scarred too. Her admission was met with mixed reactions. Some were stunned, others nodded in understanding. Many Vietnam veterans came forward to thank her, saying her presence in Nui Dat had meant more to them than she ever knew. They remembered her not just as a singer, but as a symbol of home, a reminder in those terrifying hours that life still had beauty. One veteran wrote in a public letter, "She was just a girl, but she stood on that stage like a giant. She kept singing while we were gearing up for the fight of our lives. I'll never forget her voice." Still, not everyone understood. Some in the media downplayed her trauma, suggesting she had not been in combat. It was a cruel dismissal, one that mirrored the same ignorance that had kept her silent for so long. But Pattie didn't retreat. Instead, she became an advocate. She began working closely with veteran organizations, pushing for better mental health support, especially for those whose wounds were invisible. She attended memorials, lent her voice to campaigns, and became a steady presence in the veteran community. Behind the public service was still the private burden. In interviews, she admitted that even decades later, the memories were vivid. She spoke of being overwhelmed by loud noises, of being triggered by helicopters. She learned to live with the echoes. Perhaps most powerfully, she once said, "When I went to Vietnam, I lost something. Not innocence, that goes anyway. I lost a kind of safety in the world. After that, I never felt truly safe again." What started as a goodwill tour turned into a personal war, one she would fight quietly for most of her life. And as Australia slowly came to terms with its own painful involvement in Vietnam, little Pattie's story stood out, not just as a tale of trauma, but of courage. The courage to go. The courage to smile through fear. And most of all, the courage to speak, when silence had become the easiest choice. The image of her singing in a war zone remains one of the most haunting in Australian cultural memory. But the true power of that image isn't the smile. It's what it cost her to wear it. There are many names that echo through Australia's cultural memory. Heroes, icons, and entertainers who defined an era. But few embody such a complex and quietly heroic legacy as little Pattie. To most, she was a charming teenager singing lighthearted songs in an innocent age. But through the lens of time, it becomes clear that her story is far more layered, far more haunting, and far more significant than popular memory has ever truly acknowledged. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe that what makes a legacy endure is not only the fame or the accolades, but the scars left behind, the things that were endured in silence, and the truths that were buried beneath the applause. Little Pattie's experience in Vietnam was not a chapter in her career. It was a fracture. And yet, for decades, she continued to perform, to contribute, to serve. Not just as a singer, but as a silent witness to the human cost of conflict. She never used her trauma for sympathy. She never demanded recognition. She simply endured, and when the world was finally ready to listen, she spoke, softly, bravely, honestly. It is easy to celebrate entertainers for their glamour, their talent, and their popularity. But it takes something deeper to acknowledge the emotional cost that sometimes comes with being in the wrong place at the wrong time, especially when history didn't consider you a casualty. Pattie was not a soldier. She didn't carry a weapon. But she walked into a war and came home with wounds that no one could see. In our view, she represents a rarely explored archetype in the Australian story: the civilian with the soldier's trauma, the artist with a warrior's scars. And yet, she carried herself with humility, even grace. She continued to serve, not on stage, but in veterans' halls, on memorial grounds, in advocacy groups. Her resilience was quiet but unyielding. We also see in her story a warning, a reminder that trauma doesn't discriminate, that not all damage is visible, and that even in the brightest of smiles, there can be a history of pain. What do you think? Did Australia do enough to recognize what she endured? Do we, as a culture, know how to honor those whose service was emotional rather than martial? Have we missed the depth of her story simply because it didn't fit the traditional narrative? Little Pattie may never have fired a shot or worn a medal, but she remains, undeniably, one of the most quietly courageous figures of her generation. And in a country still reckoning with the echoes of Vietnam, her voice reminds us that some battles continue long after the war ends. Sometimes history doesn't remember the ones who sang. It remembers the ones who fought, the ones who fell, and the ones who stood at the front lines with rifles in their hands. But in a dusty clearing in Vietnam, under the blinding sun of August 1966, there was a 17-year-old girl who did something just as brave. She stood on a makeshift stage and sang through fear, through chaos, through the thunder of an approaching storm. Little Pattie didn't wear camouflage. She didn't carry a weapon, but she brought something else entirely: reminders of home, of youth, of life before the war. And though the world may have clapped for her innocence, what they never truly saw was how much of that innocence stayed behind in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province. Years have passed. The songs have faded from the radio. Her name might no longer echo in the way it once did. But for those who were there, who heard her voice on the eve of bloodshed, she will never be forgotten. There is something profoundly heartbreaking about a voice that has brought comfort, but cannot find comfort for itself. Something deeply human about a life lived in service of joy, all the while shadowed by a sorrow too complicated to name. And maybe that's what makes Little Pattie's story so enduring. Not just the fame, not just the bravery, but the silence that came after. The silence that held the weight of war, long after the bullets stopped flying. Some stories are never told, but now you know. She wasn't just Australia's teen sweetheart. She was a witness, a survivor, a quiet soldier of memory, and her voice, once lost in the noise of war, still lingers, soft but unforgettable.